This week, the time machine is bouncing all over the place, from the early 20th century up to the present day, as I dive into a topic that is probably on a lot of people's minds of late. Not a particular person or villain, but a system of government utilized by many of them throughout history. Fair warning, there will be ample uses of the F word in this episode. No, not that one. I'm talking about fascism on this episode of Vintage Villains. Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to Vintage Villains. I am Allison Dickson, and I'm doing something a little differently today. Normally on this show, we talk about a bad guy or gal and use a lot of historical context to weave throughout and paint a picture of the time in which they lived. But sometimes we need to get outside of time and speak more broadly, especially when it's about things that affect society as a whole. Way back on episode 2, I spoke of a Soviet Russian executioner named Vasily Blokhin, but that episode was every bit as much about the horrors of Stalinism and Russian communism as Blokhin's own horrific acts, which he may or may not have committed had he not been part of that highly oppressive system. So let's get into it, shall we? The word fascism has been bandied about a lot throughout my life, though increasingly so in the 21st century as we attempt to identify patterns in our own leadership that either adhere to our founders' intent or diverge greatly from them. Human brains love a good shortcut. If we see enough symptoms of a particular thing, we slap a label on it and call it good enough. But just like using WebMD to diagnose yourself with pancreatic cancer if you have a stomach ache, it's usually a good idea to have more information before we start using certain words. Fascism is a very complex thing with a dense history involving a lot of complicated people and vocabulary. But I can whittle it down for you enough so that when you hear the word being flung around, you can feel a little more armed to either debate or affirm at your leisure. Let's start with the etymology. The term fascism derives from the Italian word fascio, meaning bundle or group, and that derives from the Latin word fasces, which refers to a bundle of sticks. In original Italian fascist symbolism, you'll see an axe reinforced with a bundle of sticks around the handle, the idea being that while one stick might bend and break, the group is stronger than the individual. And that's the core ideology of fascism right there, without assigning any particular left or right political leaning to it. The group is more important than the individual. If you come away from this episode with only that tidbit stuck in your mind, then I'll consider it a success. There's a historian on YouTube I found named Mr. Beat, not to be confused with Mr. Beast, who simplified this even further to a phrase, conform or else. In fascist societies, diversity and individualism is considered a threat to the overall group. They tend to be staunchly against things like immigration because outsiders, with their varying cultures and religious beliefs and economic demands, undermine the safety and strength of the core ethnic group. This may or may not include elements of strict racism. Early Italian fascism, as developed by dictator Benito Mussolini, and a bit more on him in a second, rejected the anti-Semitism and general race-cleansing philosophies of their German neighbors, at least at first. Eventually, this strong, regimented, conformist mindset with which Mussolini ruled made him more comfortable with the racist ideals. And by the late 1930s, he adopted a lot of Hitler's beliefs on the matter by endorsing the Manifesto of Race, as it was called, which proclaimed it was time to adopt openly racist policies. Mussolini claimed he only did it for political reasons, to make his fellow Axis pal Adolf happy. And a lot of fascist party leaders in the country rejected said manifesto. but it nevertheless paved the way for racism and anti-Semitism to flourish there. By the way, Nazism is a very close cousin of fascism, enforced conformity with a strong nationalist identity centered around a dictator with that extra sinister element of eugenics sprinkled in. So how did all this come to be? Well, without writing an entire dissertation in Italian history, I'll give you a few key bullet points. In 1915, Benito Mussolini was a young revolutionary who broke from the Italian Socialist Party. He went off to fight in World War I, but was sent home after being injured on the battlefield. He returned home, determined to start a movement built around continuing to fight the war, increasing militarism, all around a central core of nationalism. He published a newspaper called People of Italy, which spread the word of this movement and brought a lot of people on board. Those people, militants who attacked socialist and liberal leaders by force in towns all across the country, called themselves Black Shirts. In 1922, he and the Black Shirts staged a massive demonstration called the March on Rome, which essentially toppled the still largely imperial Italian government, and he was installed as the country's new leader. As the Black Shirts continued to use violence and intimidation to shut down critics, the government grew more totalitarian. That word, by the way, totalitarian, was originally meant in a derogatory way by Mussolini's critics to state he intended to form a total dictatorship. But it turned out old Benny, well, he liked that word just fine, and they adopted it for themselves, spinning it as a positive. They would be a strong nationalist state, creating a powerful modern Italy, the likes of which hadn't been seen since the height of the Roman Empire. But Mussolini didn't invent these ideas himself. He was likely inspired by similar movements from the late 19th century, which sought to criticize the Enlightenment movement, which formed the foundation for our own country, the United States, which enshrined the concepts of liberty, equality, and individual rights. Because for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction, there were groups heavily opposed to Enlightenment concepts. They believed instead in social hierarchies, that some were ordained to be leaders while most others were meant to be followers. This is likely a direct offshoot from the more monarchically minded, I would say. And when Charles Darwin released his writings on the concept of biological evolution, natural selection, survival of the fittest, and all that, people immediately adopted it into the societal context as well. Social Darwinism is still going strong today, and a term you probably hear quite often, at least in certain circles, and it feeds very much into these authoritarian mindsets. Anyway, what else do you tend to see in fascist-style governments, you might be wondering? I already mentioned the strong anti-immigration stances, the racism and the demonizing of, quote, the others, that threatens strict conformity to established norms. There are also mass deportations, forced sterilizations, enforced traditional family structures, strong police presence, suppression of any opposition by force, and a central dictator who claims to speak for the entire nation and holds absolute power, otherwise known as an autocrat. Fascist leaders often claim they will protect you from ugly outsiders, that they will rejuvenate what the others have broken. And that rejuvenation often comes in the form of closed borders and often waging war as a show of might. As for the economies, protectionism is strong in such systems. That is to say, the restriction of imported goods by imposing things like tariffs and quotas and other guardrails intended to protect the domestic supply of goods. This, of course, results in higher prices and lower overall supply. Corporations are a big deal in fascist systems as well, and they operate more as syndicates beholden to state interests, and therefore so do the workers, who are expected to conform or else. The thing is, unlike back in Mussolini's day, no one today would dare call themselves a fascist. We fought these people in World War II and won. But that doesn't mean people don't still hold true to the sentiments, and they will introduce them under the guise of freedom and liberty. These strongman savior types will tell us that we won't be free until we get rid of some scapegoated minority that's taking our jobs and destroying our sacred traditions. They will punish those who speak negatively about them and try to subvert their rule. They will have direct influence over the media, controlling what information you receive so that it only falls in line with their status quo. Countries all over the world who don't call themselves fascist exhibit a lot of fascist traits. It's why, although it's a concept associated more with the far right end of the political spectrum, it doesn't necessarily have to be in order to have the same suppressive effects on a population. It's why people, when I see them batting a ball back and forth about which political party most resembles fascists or communists or Nazis or whatever, it's just more signal being lost in a whole bunch of noise. The signal is this: if individual liberty and equality are important values to you, if you like the ability to say what you think, to criticize and replace your leaders through democratic elections, to make decisions about who you love and what you get to do with your body, if you love people regardless of the color of their skin or their religious beliefs or countries of origin other than your own, then you are not a fascist, and you should do everything you can to reject this form of governance and resist the implementation of policies that hearken to it. Authoritarian movements are driven largely by fear of the unknown especially. I believe when we open ourselves to each other, to the world around us, and we seek to understand our differences and live alongside one another harmoniously, we can truly see how alike we all are. That's a world I want to foster, not one fueled by animosity, scapegoating, exclusion, and hate perpetrated by a central autocratic narcissist purporting to be a savior. I want to thank you for listening to this short and somewhat different episode of Vintage Villains, my friends. Studying history is a great joy for me, but I've also come to realize what a privilege it is to even be able to do so. There are those who much prefer we didn't have access to information we all take for granted, because in lieu of such information, we become docile and ignorant, easily manipulated by those who only find glory in absolute power. I want to thank those of you who came along for this short, unique ride on the time machine. I have a new case in the works as we speak. In the meantime, stay smart, stay informed, and as I always like to say at the end of every show, get out there and make good history, and please don't forget to vote. And I'll see you next time in another century.
Do you love old Hollywood? The iconic movie stars at the center of all the glitz and glamour of Hollywood's golden age? Join me every Tuesday as I do a deep dive into some of old Hollywood's biggest names, as well as some not-so-big names. My primary focus is on the years leading up to stardom and the subsequent lives behind the scenes. Listen now to Stars of the Golden Age, a show that highlights the lives of legends from film, music, and the birth of television during Hollywood's golden age and the few years surrounding it. New shows every Tuesday. Listen now on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube Music, or Amazon Music. Please join me and we can learn about these icons together.